My guest today is Professor Peter Singer, who's Professor of BioEthics at Princeton University. He works mostly in practical ethics and is best known for animal liberation and for his writings about global poverty. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you, Gill. It's good to be talking to you.
Yeah, thanks for doing this early in the morning in Melbourne. So I want to start in possibly a slightly different point, and we want to talk about a lot of different things you have done all through your career. But you have co-edited a text of John Stuart Mill's on utilitarianism, and I guess it's coming out. You say it's coming out next month. Is it already out, or it's just coming out?
No, it's coming out in July. It is almost in July. I'm not quite sure what date in July, but Norton wanted to bring it out in July so that it could still be used for courses beginning in North America in September.
Okay. So utilitarianism, and it's a common theme in many of the work that you have done. So how do you define utilitarianism in common terms, Peter, for the audience?
Utilitarianism is the view that the right action to choose of any actions open to you is the action that, as far as you can tell, will have the best consequences. Or put more technically, the action that has the highest expected utility, because obviously the probabilities of any particular consequences will vary. So you have to discount the outcomes by the chances that you will achieve it. The other thing that should be said is when utilitarians talk about best consequences, they mean best consequences in terms of the well-being of all of those affected by the action. So, the classical utilitarians talked about happiness and the prevention of suffering or misery, pleasure or pain. You can think of well-being in different ways, but if we just say well-being, that's a good general term for what utilitarians are talking about. And they do mean all beings affected. So that includes, of course, all humans living now, but it will also include future humans insofar as we can predict how our actions will affect them. And very importantly, it includes other sentient beings who are affected by our actions. So any beings who can experience pleasure or pain, their pleasures and pains count in the calculation as well.
Yeah, so it's sort of an aggregate metric, isn't it? So if you look at the system as a whole, and if you have an objective function to maximize utility or minimize pain, it's sort of an aggregate measure, right? So I haven't read your books yet, Peter, but I listened to some of your talks, and I was thinking, so suppose I measure aggregate pain in the world today, and if we have sort of an external observer like an extraterrestrial looking at some sort of an aggregate pain measure for the world, do you think that is increasing or declining?
That's such a huge question. It's very difficult to answer. So I would say, firstly, if we focus on human beings and we think about that, I would say it's declining. The aggregate of pain is declining because I think those who are worst off are probably those who are in extreme poverty, and the number of people in extreme poverty has been falling over the last few decades. It probably didn't fall in 2020, or maybe hasn't fallen so far in 2021 because of COVID, but there was a steady downward trend for many years before that, and I expect that will resume once we get over COVID. And other indices like increasing literacy and education and so on are significant here. Now, they're not the only things that are significant. It would be good to measure, for example, whether depression is increasing or decreasing, because that's a major factor in pain and suffering. But I don't know that we have good figures on that. But the other thing is, I said, if we're talking about human beings only, if, as utilitarians do, we include non-human animals, then the huge expansion in intensive farming, which has occurred because of the rise in meat consumption in many Asian countries, China most of all, and the fact that this desire to consume more meat and animal products has been met by intensive farming with very low animal welfare standards. That's a big factor because there's something like 74 billion animals raised and killed for food each year, almost 10 times the world's human population. And the majority of them are in factory farms and living pretty miserable lives. So does that outweigh the increase in well-being by the reduction of poverty and prevention of poverty-related diseases? That's a very difficult question to weigh up these quite different forms of pain and suffering. But it's possible that it does.
Yeah, it's interesting, Peter. I talked to a lot of scientists, I talked to a lot of economists, and lately I've been talking to a lot of philosophers, even though I know nothing about philosophy. Not that I know anything about science or economics, for that matter. But your arguments appear more scientific and economic, to me, at least to my perspective, than philosophy. And so, in the grand scheme of things, if we believe, you said maybe 100 billion animals, maybe there's 1 trillion fish in the sea. We seem to be catching and eating them all. And they all feel pain at some level. So is it reasonable to assume that the trend that we are on, at least on an aggregate basis, appears to be sort of increasing pain? And I talk to a lot of life sciences researchers, neuroscience, and other areas. And what I hear from scientists is that, look, we increase lifespan by 10 years, but they don't talk about really the quality of life. And we know in the US, for example, we spend maybe 80, 90% of the cost in the last 5 to 10 years of somebody's life. And so just humans itself, it's unclear to me that we are increasing happiness or decreasing pain. Do you have a sense of that?
So for humans themselves, I think, I still think probably we are. I think that bringing modern medicine and better nutrition and vaccinations and so on, preventing diseases, probably outweighs some of the other things that you've referred to. It's not easy to know. As I say, this is such a vast question. It's extremely difficult to work out how you compare these different pains and pleasures. And there could be arguments that despite the improvement in material standards of living, the stresses of modern life are such that people are not happier. I've seen surveys saying that, although obviously China has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of extreme poverty, but a lot of people say they're not happier than they were when they were living in a more rural life in the village. They were much poorer, but they had stronger sense of community, for example. So some of those things may be really important, and that's why I can't give a definite answer on this. I'm guessing as much as anybody else would be, because we need to have those interpersonal comparisons of utility, and we don't really have good techniques for measuring that yet. We can ask people how satisfied they are with their lives, but how we weigh up those different answers to that question is also something that we haven't really got a good method for doing.
Yeah, so I get the sense that when we look at average numbers in terms of lifespan, in terms of people living in extreme poverty and things like that, we get some positive trends in them. But it doesn't look like, to me at least, that I should say it's unclear to me that we are actually improving things. So when when I talk to scientists and economists, they're all very optimistic. Scientists are extremely optimistic. that things are really improving. We are curing diseases, we are, keeping people alive longer, number of years. But in some sense, are we sort of fooling ourselves, from an aggregate metric perspective?
Well, it's not only the science that is relevant here, it's also what people are able to choose for themselves, what they want. So you referred to keeping people alive longer. But the question is, do people want to be kept alive longer in that state? Now, until quite recently, nowhere in the world could people really choose, or at least legally choose, to end their lives in a humane way if they were ill and doctors were keeping them alive. But that's something that has changed over the past few decades, that more and more countries allow either voluntary euthanasia or medical assistance in dying, so that people have more choice about how long they want to live. And that seems to me to be a clear gain in terms of reducing pain and suffering, because what's the point of forcing people to stay alive when particularly if they're terminally ill or incurably ill, and they judge that their condition is one that they would rather not be in. They would rather not exist at all than be in that condition. So that's not a scientific gain. It's an ethical gain, I would say, that the argument in favor of allowing doctors to assist their patients to die under certain conditions, of course, with safeguards, that is now increasingly accepted. And that's something that I see as a gain in terms of utility. And there are many other social reforms that we can think of in that sense as well. Obviously, allowing women greater equality, allowing them more choice as to how to live their lives. That, I think, is clearly a gain. Allowing people to express their sexual preferences, if they're gay, or if they have some other abnormal sexual inclinations that don't harm others, that consenting adults can take part in. Again, we used to repress that, and I'm sure that was a cause of great misery for some people. Now we're, at least in many parts of the world, we're much more open about that. So there's a whole lot of social changes as well, ethical changes that I think are in a positive direction, and need to be considered in trying to decide this big question about whether the aggregate is going up or down.
Yeah, so I wasn't going there first, but sometimes I feel that incrementalism, from a policy perspective, this might be one area where, Peter, we might have some differences. I would love to debate with you on this. And most areas, I think, I grew up in South India. I grew up as a Catholic in South India. I came to the US to go to graduate schools. I consider myself to be agnostic. So most of the areas that you talk about, I think we will have agreement. But incrementalism, you talked about sort of making policy more practical and realistic. I sometimes feel, life is too short for incrementalism. If you find something wrong, we have to tackle it. We cannot just say, well, in 50 years things will be better.
Well, I don't think we should just say in 50 years things will be better. I think we should do things to make them better, and that's what I've been doing all my life. I've been advocating change in the area we just talked about, giving people more autonomy as to how they die, but perhaps on a larger scale, change in terms of assisting people in extreme poverty. When we are relatively affluent and comfortable, I've been arguing since my first article on this was published in 1972, that we ought to be doing more for people in extreme poverty. And I'm founded the organization, The Life You Can Save, to help people to do that, to find the most effective charities that they can contribute to or support that will give them the best value for their donations in terms of assisting people in extreme poverty. I've also obviously written animal liberation and worked with animal organizations to try to improve conditions of animals. So I'm certainly not saying, you know, well, don't worry, in 50 years things will be better. I'm saying we must push for changes and improvements. But I'm still an incrementalist in the sense that I don't believe that it's possible to have a kind of revolutionary transformation of all of these issues. Many utopians of the past have thought that there's something that links all of these things and we need to do something that will produce a radically different society. But we haven't really seen any of those attempts come to a successful transformation. We've sometimes seen revolutionaries take over countries. Obviously, the largest example was in Russia and the formation of the Soviet Union and then the transformation of many other countries into communist countries. But they have not produced the utopia that people were hoping for, the sort of society that Marx wanted, where everyone would produce according to their ability and receive according to their need. I think that we have to be incrementalists. We have to make peaceful reforms along the way. I don't really see that there's another strategy that's likely to be successful.
Yeah, I know. So you had mentioned before in one of your talks that, you know, we had a great president who left just a few months ago, Donald Trump, Brexit decision. So the larger question would be, will we get these types of issues happening regardless? You know, is it a property of the system that, you know, Donald Trump might return in 2024, regardless of what we do? In which case the strategies one needs to pursue are quite different.
Well, I'm not sure. You know, if we just focus on how can we best prevent Trump returning in 2024, one answer would be to become active in the democratic political process in the United States and try and persuade as many people as possible not to vote for Trump or Trump supporters. And the alternative might be to say, well, we need to overthrow the democratic system so that we can establish good government and keep Trump and Trump supporters out. But if you attempted that strategy, you're essentially saying that civil war is better than the chances of using the democratic channels. And I think that could be a catastrophe, both in the sense that a lot of people could get killed, clearly, in this civil war, but also that there's no guarantee that the people that I regard as the good guys would win. In fact, it's quite possible that the Trump supporters have more guns sitting in their homes than the anti-Trump people. So I don't think that that's an answer to, you know, how do we best ensure that we don't have another term of office of President Trump.
Yeah, so let's go into a couple of your books. So the first one, so the latest one in the series of things that you have written is Why Vegan? That's the latest book, right?
It's the latest book that I've written, yes. I did edit an edition of a very ancient novel called The Golden Ass by Apuleius, which came out after Why Vegan. But I edited it and abridged it and wrote an afterword to it about why I think it's a really interesting and important early novel. But no, I didn't write it. So yes, Why Vegan is the most recent book that I've written.
Yeah, so we can talk about The Golden Ass. I find that really fascinating. So you said this is sort of the first novels that we know existed, right? Like from 2nd century AD.
That's right, from the 2nd century of the Common Era. So written under the Roman Empire, at the time of, say, Marcus Aurelius, when he was emperor, perhaps. Yeah, and it's written in Latin, but by an African, actually. Apuleius was born in what's now Algeria, and seems to have spoken some of the indigenous languages of that area, and then have learnt both Latin and Greek, and traveled extensively in the Roman Empire at the time. So we get a remarkable picture of life under the Roman Empire in the 2nd century. But the reason that I was particularly interested in it was that it's about a man who is interested in magic, and the magic goes wrong, and he gets turned into a donkey. So you get this picture of the Roman Empire from the point of view of a donkey, with a lot of empathy for the donkey, and a lot of accounts of how the donkey is mistreated. I mean, it's not sort of a horror story. It's kind of a comic tale in a way. It's a bawdy adventure story. Often you think the donkey is about to get killed and that will be the end, but the donkey survives. So it's fun, and I like it for that reason. But of course, I do also find it remarkable that in this period of the Roman Empire, when of course one of the big public forms of entertainment was watching animals being forced to fight each other or to fight gladiators in the Colosseum, in the Roman arenas, that here's an author who has this remarkable empathy for animals.
Yeah, so I haven't read the book, Peter, but I got a sense of this. So he dabbles in magic. He turns into a donkey, and his whole perspective from that point on is a donkey's perspective, right? So how does he live? How is he treated? How is he mistreated? Fundamentally. And really a donkey's life in the Roman era, right? And it basically teaches us a lot of different things, I think. How humans may have lived then, and perhaps how humans may have evolved since then.
Yes, it is really interesting. And there are many respects in which we can identify with the motivations of the Romans. As I said, there's a fair amount of sex in it, and often that's what the donkey is observing in terms of, you know, the adulterous relationships of the people who own the donkey who the donkey finds out about, and what happens. So, you know, these kinds of jealousies and so on, I think people can readily identify with today. The occasional sadism is unfortunately still around in regard to treatment of animals, but much more there's simply a element of brutality and of exploitation of the animals. So at one point the donkey gets sold to a miller, and the donkey's job, together with other donkeys and horses, is to turn the millstone to grind the wheat into flour. And it's basically like a factory, except the labor supply is from the animals. And they walk round and round all day in circles, and turning this millstone, and then they get barely enough rations to keep them going to be able to do it tomorrow. And the other really interesting thing about this particular episode is that there are human slaves there as well, who are also forced to work. They don't provide the labor power, but they are forced to work in various other ways, and they force the donkeys to work. So we get this picture of slavery in the Roman Empire. We get the picture of the way the animals are treated. And it's not that different, really, from the factory farms that we were talking about before, where the animals aren't supplying the labor power, but they are also just cogs in a machine to produce meat or milk or eggs. And so that's one of the things I say in my essay in the afterword to the book, that if we ask ourselves, how much have we advanced in terms of our treatment of animals as compared to the Roman Empire? Well, we have advanced in some ways, but if we take into account this vast unseen number of animals right now confined in factory farms, leading pretty miserable lives, you couldn't say that we inflict less suffering on animals as a whole than the Romans did.
Yeah, I mean, it's a sophisticated view in some sense, because it's really sort of portraying a class system. Donkey being at the bottom, maybe human slaves on top of the donkey, and then the rulers above the human slaves, sort of a system, right? And we have that today. I don't think we have progressed a lot more than that. Yeah, the concept remains exactly the same, don't they?
Yes, in many respects. I suppose we don't officially or legally have slaves, but of course we know that many people's situation is scarcely better than slavery. That's true. And we also have, because perhaps Apuleius was from part of the Romans might have thought of the colonies. He was not a Roman. You also get this view of the Roman soldiers who are ruling the provinces of the Roman Empire and the way they treat not just the animals, but also the local inhabitants. Particularly, at one point, the donkey is owned by a market gardener who's very poor, and a Roman soldier wants to take the donkey. The gardener is using the donkey to carry vegetables to the market, and the Roman soldier wants the donkey, and the gardener doesn't speak Latin or not well, so he's abused and mistreated, even worse than he would be anyway, because of his inability to speak the language of the ruling masters of the Roman Empire.
Do you think we are any better now, Peter? I mean, you have studied this a lot. So do you think we are any better in modern times?
Well, human nature changes very slowly, but it does change, and culture clearly plays a role in changing it. And I do think that a lot of thinking about ethical issues is better. That is, for example, as I said, we don't officially allow slavery, and if things are exposed, like what the Roman soldier did to the market gardener, that would then lead to some discipline against the soldier, just as when police brutality and police murder, in fact, against African Americans is captured on video and exposed, then the judicial process comes into action, and at least now it seems like it deals severe sentences to the abusers and the murderers, which I don't think would have been very likely to happen in those times, even apart from the fact they didn't have video cameras, of course. So I think to some extent, yes, we do make progress, and in other ways that I've already mentioned. But definitely there are human beings today who, if they were not in the public eye, if they could get away with it, would do things to the lower groups just as brutally as people were doing in Roman times.
Yeah, it seems more sophisticated, but at the heart of it, at least from my perspective, it appears similar. As they say in the US, corruption. If you're really doing corruption, then you deal with millions of dollars. You don't deal with thousands of dollars, because that is a sure way to get caught.
Mm-hmm. Right.
You have hundreds of millions of dollars of corruption. And so, in some sense, it's more sophisticated. It's a higher scale problem. But I don't know if anything really has changed ultimately. We have some cosmetic aspects around it. We talk about it, and sometimes we catch some people doing bad things, but there are hundreds of those things that go uncaught. Nobody was around with a video camera.
Yes. Oh, that's unfortunately true. Yes, we still have a lot of problems, and as I say, there are certainly plenty of people who do bad things when they can get away with it. All the same, I think, and in fact, it's interesting reading the Golden Ass. You see the concerns for security were, I think, a lot greater than they are, at least in affluent societies today. So the young man who eventually gets turned into the donkey goes to stay with somebody in a town because he's interested in traveling to this region because it's famous for its magic, and he's recommended to stay with a wealthy person who's somebody he knows has recommended him to. But you can see the people there. They have strong rooms where they keep their silver. They have bars on the doors. They have to guard their own property to an extent that people don't, generally speaking, in the United States or Australia or Europe. People can be more relaxed in terms of of course, you may still get robbed or burgled, but the chances seem to be much smaller than they were. So in that sense, we feel more secure in our persons, I think, than Romans did.
Yeah, so I want to talk a bit about, this is an area that you have done a lot of work, you've written a lot of books, and ethics and treatment of animals. So the first book came out in the late 70s?
Animal Liberation came out in 1975, so mid-70s.
So Animal Liberation, and the fundamental idea here, if I understand this, Peter, is that there isn't a distinct difference between humans and animals who can feel pain, and hence when we use animals for food, for anything, we have to be really aware of that idea. Is that the way to think about it?
Yes. I'm not exactly saying that there are no differences or that there aren't important differences, but what I am saying is that the differences are not such that we are entitled to think that the pains or suffering of non-human animals don't count, or even that they are not as important as the pains of human beings simply because these are not members of our species. I think that's the attitude that I'm challenging here, is the idea that all humans are in this higher moral status sphere. That is, that all humans have rights, human rights we talk about, that all humans are equal in some important sense. And then there are these non-human animals who don't have rights, who are not our equals. Okay, most people would say, well, you shouldn't be cruel to them just for the fun of it, but we're entitled to use them to meet our interests, like to produce cheap meat, eggs, milk, and so on. And that's what I'm objecting to. I'm saying, well, yes, we're different. We have different interests. At least most humans do. Most humans are, capable of thinking about the world in a way that non-human animals are not. But when it comes to pain or suffering or enjoying your life, non-human animals are capable of all of those things. And we shouldn't say that the pain of an animal is less significant than the pain of a human, because if it's not a human, it doesn't count. That's really, I think, the attitude that in practice we work with. We couldn't have factory farms, or we couldn't do the things we do to animals in laboratories if we gave serious consideration to their interests, and we are not justified in denying them that serious consideration.
So for an external observer, though, Peter, I was wondering, this is how sort of the system is set up, isn't it? I mean, we have prey, we have predators, every animal kills other animal, not every, but a large number of them. Isn't that sort of how the system is set up from an external observer's perspective?
Well, I mean, yes, maybe it is, but so what, right? I mean, the system has also been that dominant races of humans killed or enslaved other races of humans. The system has also been that men, being physically stronger than women, dominated women and ruled over them and made them their possessions. There's no moral lessons to be learnt from the fact that evolution set up a system like that. We resist that in many other respects. We've been talking about whether there's moral progress. We're certainly trying to make progress beyond that system of might makes right. And if we can do it for the races and the sexes, then why can't we do it for the species?
Right. So there is really no natural way to make that effective, right? In other words, if the objective function of the system is very simple, it is, sort of replication and sustenance, so to speak, then we have, bunch of things in the system that is basically trying to replicate themselves or pass on their genes. That is sort of how the world appears to be behaving. But are we saying that we have sort of broken out of that context? We can see things a lot different.
Yes, that's correct. This system, which I agree is a system of replication, survival and reproduction, has given rise to beings who are self-aware, who can accumulate knowledge, including the knowledge of evolution itself, and we can make ethical choices. And we are making ethical choices all the time that are not simply saying, well, let the system continue in the sense of let's see who can replicate themselves better. We don't set that as a goal. We have a lot of other goals to try to make things work better in accordance with a set of values that we have. And I've talked about the values that I hold, the utilitarian values. Obviously, we can discuss values, but that's what we're trying to do. I think we're trying to at least soften the edges of the system in terms of the values that we hold.
Yeah, I mean, the question in my mind is still, is it possible for some actors in the system, given its objective function, can actually change the system? Because objective function appears fairly simplistic, and it has remained simplistic and stable for millions of years.
Yeah, well, but we are changing it in various ways. Now it may be that you could see that still in terms of replication, but it's not replication in the way that has existed previously. That is, how many children do you have, and how many of those children survive to have their own children? Humans make all kinds of choices. Some humans have chosen to be celibate for a variety of reasons, often religious reasons. Some humans have chosen to have fewer children than they could have, even though they could provide for those children, and children could grow up and have more children themselves. So we do make those choices as individuals all the time. And we also make these choices as societies. We tend to be kinder than the pure naked evolutionary system would suggest. In a way, we help people who are weak, who have problems with reproducing, and we help people who are old and no longer reproducing to have better lives, and we help people who don't have share as many of our genes as others. On the strict evolutionary terms, we would help those who are our kin, and we would not help strangers. But in fact, there are a lot of people who do help strangers, and that also goes contrary to the system that you're describing.
That is true, but again, from a kind of a total system perspective, we have 1 billion people earning less than $2 a day. We had this pandemic that it's actually very puzzling, because you cannot get to a herd immunity, as I call it, from a scientific perspective, till you get about 6 billion people vaccinated. So it is really a non-economic, non-scientific process to get. So we have 200 different countries, and every country follows, its own policies. And some countries try to get to 60%, 70% on their own. It's never going to help us manage a pandemic that's a worldwide problem. And so, so we talk about all these things, but it seems to me that we are not really set up to solve sort of a systemic problems to the world. We, sort of smooth around it, we talk around it. Politicians get elected or not get elected. But at the end of the day, the results appear to be the same all around the world.
I think that's too pessimistic. I agree with a lot of what you say, that we're not set up to deal with global problems. I wrote a book back in 2002 called One World, which had then a new edition called One World Now, just a few years ago, in which I was exactly making that point, that we have global problems and we don't have the global institutions to handle them. And the pandemic is certainly one of those global problems, but before the pandemic, we had climate change as one. There are several that I talk about in the book. And, we do the best we can. And on climate change, obviously, the fact that President Biden replaced President Trump has been a big plus, because it's taken the US back into these discussions of climate change and into the Paris Agreement. And I'd say there's a glimmer of hope that we will get control of climate change before it's catastrophic. Though I'm not saying more than a glimmer, but under Trump, seemed like almost no hope. So I think, there are prospects of making progress. On the pandemic, well, I think we will get there. Of course, vaccinating people is one way of getting herd immunity. The other way of getting herd immunity is you expose the whole population to the virus, and many of them get ill, and some of them die, and some of them recover. So I think we will eventually get there too, although clearly we could do better if we had stronger global cooperation, and if the wealthy nations provided the vaccines that are needed for the poorer nations. So I do see some changes. And, you mentioned 1 billion people are living on less than $2 a day. In fact, before the pandemic, it had got down to 736 billion, according to the World Bank's estimates. So that was considerable progress. It was actually, if you go back 20 years or something, it was was over 1 billion. It was 1.2 billion. So it was coming down. I think now they think it's perhaps going up to 800 billion again because of the pandemic. But as I say, I hope that it will resume that downward trajectory once the pandemic has passed.
Yeah. So I want to touch on a couple of other things that you have thought a lot about. One is race. And so, from a scientific perspective, there is no race. So we have essentially 8.4 billion people who are almost clones to each other. National Geographic had a program a few years ago where you can send a saliva sample and it'll tell you where your genes came from. And, my family has been in South India forever. I had never traveled out of there. And my heat map showed up in Rome, Netherlands, and Spain, in addition to North India. And so do you think, so I often wondered if this is an education problem, which is if 8 billion people knew they are exact clones to each other, do you think we will advance in our policy prescriptions?
Well, that's an exaggeration, though, right? We're not exact clones of each other, clearly.
Close
and I mean, the claim that there is no scientific such thing as race, and it needs to be unpacked a little bit. It's obviously true that the standard popular views of race and of who people belong, and the idea that they're, completely genetically different, that idea is clearly false and quite unscientific. Are you still there? I've just lost your image.
Just 1 minute, Peter. I think just give me 2 seconds.
Okay.
Can you see me now?
Nope. Now I can. Yes, good. You're back. Okay.
Sorry.
So to resume, as I say, the popular idea of race that we're all quite different is clearly false. But the other view that's often being said that there is, that it's all entirely social construction is also false. There are, on average, genetic differences between races, and that's obvious from the fact that different diseases are more likely. I have a European Jewish background. I would be more likely to have a child with Tay-Sachs disease than, I don't know whether Tay-Sachs exists in people of Southern Indian descent, but my guess is that it probably doesn't. Certainly it doesn't exist to nearly the same extent in Europeans of non-Jewish background. So, there are those differences on average. So, people seize on them, and certainly they beat them up into something much larger and more significant than they are. And that is a factor in terms of racism in the community. I see this as, you were talking about evolution and what it's given rise to. I think it has given rise to a certain kind of xenophobia, that is, to the idea that people who look like me, perhaps look like my parents, I'm more likely to think positively of than people who look different from me. And, that can be combated socially, of course, and it should be. And when we are used to diverse societies with a lot of people who look different, we're much less likely to have those sorts of xenophobic attitudes. But the problem is that unscrupulous politicians can appeal to them. They're still there in some latent form. And we've seen that so often. I mean, obviously, Hitler came to power by appealing to this xenophobic reaction against the people who were part of the German community and had been for hundreds of years, the Jewish people. But he was still able to appeal to that and stir it up in Germany. And Donald Trump was able to stir this up against immigrants, against Mexicans who he said were all rapists and so on. And that seemed to get some resonance amongst some of the American electorate, incredible as that may seem. So that's the problem, I think, that it's not that there's nothing there. There is something latently there, and it's affected by the society, and we need to have a positive environment to minimize it and come as close as possible to eliminating it. But it's there for people to stir up when they see an advantage in doing so.
Yeah, so I was thinking about the scientific basis, Peter. So, the race as we see it is a fairly tactical thing, right? So my understanding is that the Homo sapiens went through a bottleneck. We had at some point only 15,000 samples left on Earth. And so if you rewind time back sufficiently long, we will see from a scientific perspective, there is no difference. But it's very difficult for people to internalize because the surface features that we assign so much importance to are all highly tactical, but that is what we see. But that is what actually prescribes policies. We have 200 different countries. So I want to test this on you. I think you have a slightly different opinion on this. I consider myself to be a universalist. I would say there are no needs for countries countries are really a sort of a segmentation scheme. There is no reason for religions. There is another segmentation scheme. So we have invented all the segmentation schemes to sort of segment ourselves into something that has really no real meaning or relevance. I know that you have a slightly different opinion on this.
Well, look, I agree that it would be much better if we could have open borders and not have countries or have, and as I said, I wrote this book, One World, which really is advocating global governance. I thought it was premature to say a world government, but more institutions of global governance, like strengthening the United Nations, like the International Criminal Court, like just ways of reaching agreements and enforcing agreements on climate change. I think we need all of those sorts of global institutions. And as far as religion is concerned, I'm an atheist, and I find it extraordinary that religion does persevere to the extent that it does. But again, I see that as simply something that people want to believe, that they have evolved with this tendency to believe in God or something beyond nature that we can observe. And I think Richard Dawkins wrote about that quite well. To a large extent, I'm in agreement with you, but I also, and here I guess I am an incrementalist, I think that for a politician to advocate open borders would be a disaster, because then the opponents would seize this advantage, and they would say, exactly as Trump did, do you want to be swamped by all of these people who are different from you, and would say worse things, of course, than they were different, starting off with the fact that they were rapists, as Trump did. It's, to actually advocate this by a serious politician, I think is just a recipe for handing over power to the racists and the unscrupulous people who will stir up racism. That is a disaster, was a disaster for 4 years under Donald Trump. It's been very bad in some European countries like Hungary and Poland, where autocrats have played the same kind of xenophobic card and have retained power and to some extent popularity. So I think we can only do what we can. I think my goals and yours are probably the same, but I see it as necessary to not get too far ahead of where the electorate is on these issues.
Do you see a difference in the next generation? So one could argue our generation hasn't really done sufficiently, it hasn't done enough to actually make a difference. But do you see a difference in the next generation, how they approach these problems?
No, not really. I mean, I think, people keep saying this, right? You could say, well, the generation of Germans who voted for Hitler was a racist generation, and subsequent ones are not. And certainly, Germany has done more to eliminate that kind of racism than most countries in the aftermath of the war and the catastrophe that meant for Germany. But does that mean that racism has disappeared in the current generation in Germany? No, not really. When Angela Merkel opened the borders to Syrian asylum seekers, refugees, there was a backlash. There were still some people who were hostile to accepting non-Germans into Germany, and even she, brave woman as she is, had to pull back to some extent. So I don't see it as, the next generation as being the solution. Hopefully they'll be a little bit better than past generations. Hopefully we'll make progress generation by generation. But will these xenophobic impulses have been eliminated in the next generation? I don't see that as changing so rapidly.
Yeah, so I sometimes wonder, Peter, so you have the social media things like Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and so on. Would we come to a position that we will have races we'll have a Twitter race, we'll have a Facebook race, and so on. Because that's where all the people are. And
yeah, that's where the people are. But in fact, they then segregate themselves, don't they? I mean, that's the problem, that you have groups on the internet, maybe Facebook groups, or if Facebook tries to outlaw them, then they'll go somewhere else. You have the white supremacist groups that will find ways of staying in touch with each other and communicating with each other, just as you have the progressive groups who do that. So, no, I think that there are things that go deeper in our nature than your allegiance to Facebook or Twitter.
Do you think these big social networks are to a position that they have to be regulated? Are they?
Yes, I do think they need to be regulated, and it seems to me that one of the problems is that they have rendered the laws that countries have about defamation or libel. They've rendered them kind of pointless, because people can post things and they get circulated, and Facebook itself, let's say, is immune from the libel suit. Quite different from a newspaper, which if a newspaper published an article, even a letter written into the newspaper by someone else that was defamatory, the newspaper would be liable. I don't really understand why countries haven't passed laws holding that websites that publish defamatory material are themselves, can themselves be sued for defamation. I think that would dramatically change the way these websites operate. It would be more restrictive, of course, but I think it would cut out a lot of the nonsense that gets posted on websites.
Is it the competitive landscape that's the issue? I mean, Facebook, for instance, has 1.5 billion people on it. So, from any stretch of the imagination, one could consider that to be a monopoly. But a federal, judge that threw out a monopoly lawsuit against them. And so is that the real issue, that they have so much power? They are natural monopolies. They have to be sort of considered to be utilities rather than companies.
I'm not sure, because the point that I just made, that people can post defamatory material on Facebook, would be the same if there were 10 Facebooks or competitors to Facebooks, all sharing some of that market, but all under the same laws, and all allowing people to put on their website that Hillary Clinton is running a pedophile ring out of a pizza shop in Washington, D.C. Right? I mean, no newspaper could publish that. They would immediately be sued for millions. But Facebook and other websites can put that nonsense on it, and they're immune. So to me, that's where the problem lies.
It's a bit of a slippery slope, isn't it, Peter? I mean, can we really have an objective criteria to say X is wrong and Y is right? There's always going to be a gray area there, right?
Well, there are certainly gray areas, but I think there's no gray area about whether Hillary Clinton has ever run a pedophile ring out of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. And if somebody makes such claim, they have to put up evidence to show that it's true. And nobody has put up any such evidence to show that it's true, of course, because it isn't true. So I think that's not a gray area at all. And we've had courts deciding that kind of thing for a long time, and there still are defamation cases. They're a little harder to win in the United States than they are, say, here in Australia, where I am. We have a major defamation case going on at the moment, being brought by somebody who was an Australian soldier in Afghanistan and lauded as a war hero. And now there's evidence indicating that he may have killed unarmed Afghan prisoners, and he's suing for defamation. So, I mean, the courts will no doubt adjudicate on that and look at the evidence to see whether they're going to award him damages or not. That's the job of the courts, and I think that's how it should be.
Yeah, you mentioned United Nations. I want to touch on that quickly. So do you think United Nations is sort of antiquated? We have the Security Council with 6 permanent members. it appears that the job is counting ICBMs and making sure it's not thrown one way or the other. But they had no role to play in the management of the pandemic. So, those types of structures, are they really needed anymore?
I think they still have a useful role. They may not be able to do everything that we would like them to do. But I think we're better off having them than not having them. Yes, the composition of the Security Council is antiquated because the permanent powers with the veto derives from the victors of the Second World War. And I think that does need change, and there have been various proposals for reforming that. So I think there are specifics that can be changed, but I think we still need the United Nations. In fact, I'd like to see a stronger United Nations.
Yeah, I know that you're working on a couple more, I guess, editing books or writing books. I can't quite remember. So what are you working on right now?
I'm revising Animal Liberation, which we talked about earlier, which was first published in 1975. There's a complete revision in 1990, and there are some later editions with minor changes since, but it really needs a full update. So I'm hoping that sometime in 2022, perhaps a completely new, fully revised edition of Animal Liberation will appear.
And the Golden Ass, is that out already?
The Golden Ass is out, yes. That's available, published by Norton in the United States and in the United Kingdom, and by Text Publishing here in Australia. And some other translations of my edition will be coming out as well. But yes, I hope people will have a look at that. I hope they'll enjoy it. I think it's the most entertaining book, maybe, the lightest book in a sense that I've produced. It's a good read, so I hope people will pick it up and maybe give it to somebody as a present. I think it's beautifully illustrated, by the way. I got some Russian illustrators, twin sisters, to provide illustrations for it. So it's a nice little package.
So are you teaching this quarter or?
Not this quarter. I will be teaching again in September. I'm planning to go back for the fall semester to Princeton.
Excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Peter. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Thanks very much, Gill. It's been good to talk to you. We've ranged pretty widely, but it's always been interesting. A lot of good topics.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.